All right, so we're going to go to the Bible, the book of Isaiah, the 7th chapter, or Daniel 7. I'm sorry, Daniel, the 7th chapter. In the first verse, it says, in the first year of Belshazzar, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters of the four beasts. And we know that according to verse 17, if we jump down to verse 17 in Daniel 7, it tells us that these great beasts, which are four kings, which shall arise out of the earth. So by four kings, we're speaking about four empires, four kingdoms. To prove that, we're going to jump down again, just to kind of context to what we're reading, jumping down to verse 23 to show 17, right? This is the fourth beast of those four beasts mentioned in verse 17. It says that this shall be the fourth kingdom, not the fourth king, the fourth kingdom upon the earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms and shall devour the whole earth and shall tread it down, which came after the empire of sex. But we're going to jump up to verse number, verse number 6. Oh, verse number 6 tells us the following. After this I beheld, and lo, another, meaning another beast or another kingdom, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast dominion was given unto it. So now, in order to get the interpretation of this prophecy, we're going to go into it has now become history. Okay? So we're going to jump over, to the historical aspect of it. But before we do so, we're going to go over one chapter to the book of Daniel, chapter 8, because Daniel 8 elaborates on this third beast, this third kingdom. All right. So we're going to jump down, get straight to the point. Verse 20. Now, the whole chapter goes into there, but then it shows the transition from the Persian Empire into the Greek Empire, and how the Persian Empire the Medo-Persian was overtaken and conquered by the Greek Empire. But we're going to get straight to the point, to verse number 20, where it says, which thou sawest having 2 horns, meaning 2 powers, or representing 2 powers, are the kings of Media and Persia. It's the symbolism referring to this, or representing this empire, a beast or a kingdom with two powers. All right. Daniel 7 makes mention of this as a bear raised up on one side. So it was an empire with 2 different nations, but one of those nations aspect of the empire, but nonetheless, they were a joint kingdom of 2 nations. The Medes being descendants of Japheth, when you go to the book of Daniel, and the Persians, believe it or not, are descendants of Shem. All right, so you have Japhite. A rough goat is the king of Grecia. All right, so when it says the rough goat is the king of Grecia, this is speaking about the kingdom of Grecia, not one individual, but the kingdom itself. It goes on to say, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now, this king is in reference to one man. That one man being the first king of. So, okay, so getting back. Now let's go into the historical fulfillment of this kingdom or this prophecy. Okay, so what we established first is the fact that the empire, whose imposition against the nation of Israel sparked a rebellion, sparked the revolution, which in turn sparked this new celebration called the Feast of Dedication. This kingdom was prophesied in the Old Testament. Okay, now going to the book of Deuteronomy 28, because I mentioned earlier that Deuteronomy 28 contains prophetic curses which reoccur throughout Scripture, throughout different captivities. So we're going to go to one in particular, and we're going to jump around because in the lesson that was prepared, there are also mentionings or examples of prophecies in Deuteronomy or curses in Deuteronomy that were fulfilled through the Greek captivity. So going straight to one of the points I wanted to pull out, okay, in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse number 49, where it says, "The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of old, nor show favor to the young." So this took place during the a few empires. Okay, we know, of course, that the eagle is a symbolization, okay, or is a symbol of the nation of Edom, where it says in the book of Obadiah, the first chapter, "Though thou exalt thyself as the eagle." So we know we have correlation, but also, and we see throughout, we know going back to the book of Genesis, the 27th chapter, and let's get it here. The prophecy given to in the book of Genesis chapter 27, verse 40, it says, "And by the so Esau would excel through warfare and shall serve thy brother, who is Jacob. And it shall come to dominion," meaning what? That eventually he would break from the rulership of Jacob. He was under the rulership of Jacob for a short period of time, mainly under the rulerships of David and Solomon, and mainly through Solomon. I think after Solomon, he started to break free, as it makes mention in the book of 1 Kings, the 11th chapter. But Esau did serve Jacob for a short period of time in our history, but the utmost fulfillment have not yet been fulfilled. So it says, "And it shall come to pass when thou shalt have the dominion," showing that Esau would have empires. He would have dominions in the earth. He would not a few times, but eventually just disappear from the face of the earth. That would not become the case for Esau. He would gain rulership over the earth through, and we believe that that rulership begins with the Greek Empire under Alexander the Greek. And then it goes on to say that thou shalt break his yoke, meaning the history of this particular holy day. We're going to now transition over to the Apocrypha. And I believe I was probably making a point before going to Genesis 27, but it had come back to me. I forgot the point I was alluding to before going to that scripture, but it had come back. At this time, we're going to go to the book of First Maccabees. All right. And our goal, in case anyone is wondering, our goal is to answer as many questions as we can concerning the Feast of Dedication. So thus far, we have the historical aspect or the prophetic aspect. Now we're moving to the historical aspect. We're going to the book of Maccabees. So let me pull up Eastward. Okay. Let's open up Eastward. And let's go to our Apocrypha. So we're opening up to the book of First Maccabees, the first chapter. First Maccabees 1:1 tells us the following. Deuteronomy 28, as it relates to that nation that would come upon us, flieth, was significant of Esau and his empires, but before him, also it was partly fulfilled with the king of Babylon. Okay. In the book of Ezekiel, I want to say Ezekiel 19. Let me check here. In the book of Ezekiel, let me get the chapter. The king of Babylon is likened unto an eagle who would conquer. Let's get that prophecy real quick. We're not going to read it, but we're just going to get the actual chapter so that you can go back. Yes, Ezekiel 17. Somebody pull it up here. Ezekiel chapter 17, which had diverse colors, came on and took the highest branch of the cedar. And I believe as we go down, let me see here. In verse number 12, it says, say now to the rebellious house, know ye not what these things mean? Tell them, behold, the king of Babylon is come to Jerusalem, and have taken the king thereof, and the princes thereof, and have led them with him to Babylon. So the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, was likened unto a eagle who came and. But we know, again, those prophecies are reoccurring. So you have another nation likened unto an eagle who would conquer the land of Jerusalem. And we're going into that empire. If you remember, we read Daniel, the 8th chapter. It tells us that the ram represented the two empires of Media and Persia. Here it's told us that the first king who ruled over the Greek Empire smote both Darius, or smote. So if we go back real quick to the book of, let me just go back to it just to show you the correlation between the prophecy and the history of this. Let's see. Daniel 8 and verse number 20, it says, the ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. So now we see the fulfillment of those two horns, or those two kingdoms, being conquered. By who? Alexander the Greek. Now check out what verse 21 says about Alexander. It says, and the rough goat is the king, or the kingdom of Grecia. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Who is the first king over Greece? Let's see again. First Maccabees 1:1 says, and it happened that after Alexander, son of Philip, the book of Daniel's the 8th chapter, that he reigned in his stead the first over Greece. First king over the Grecian Empire, or the first king over the rough goat, is who? Alexander, son of Philip. It goes on to say that he made many wars and won many strongholds and slew the kings of the Babylon, who at one point, or of the kings of Babylon, who at one point had a prominent empire, kings of the Medes and the Persians, who at one point had prominent empires over the earth. And now he was the ruler of those empires, took land of Minor, okay, ruled over Macedonia, so on and so forth. So it says he made many wars, speaking of Alexander, and won many strongholds. He won over many lands. Many lands came down under his rulership. And it says that he slew, excuse me, it says that he slew the kings of the earth. All right. Make sure you're still with me. All right. Okay, someone says it's buffering. All right. All right. Okay, someone says they restarted YouTube and it's fine. Okay, can you see a picture? Okay, someone says it's clear at the moment. All right, so what I'll try to do to limit issues going forward is I'll limit the jumping back and forth of the share screen. Maybe I'll make sure that I keep that to a minimum. Someone says a lot of static. Is there anyone else experiencing static? Okay, how about now? All right. One moment. Okay. All right. I want to make sure it's clear. Someone says it's still staticky, experiencing a little static. All right. Okay, it says no static now. Okay, wonderful. All right. So, all right. So getting back to the point, we're now going to the book of Maccabees. Okay. The book of Maccabees, the first chapter, and picking up in the second verse where it says, First Maccabees 1 and 2, it says, and made many wars, meaning Alexander, son of Philip, made many wars and won many strongholds and slew the kings of the earth. All right. So this is giving us the history of how the Greeks came into prominence, their empire. All right. Now, it goes on to say in verse 3 and went through to the ends of the earth and took spoil of many nations, and so much that the earth was quiet before him, whereupon he was exalted and his heart was lifted up. And he gathered a mighty strong host and ruled over countries and nations and kings who became tributaries unto him. So, as I mentioned, he became the ruler over many kingdoms, over many lands, such as Babylon, such as Persia, such as Egypt, such as Syria, and eventually Palestine. Okay. Now it says here, it says in verse number 5, and let me see here if I have an example of his empire. All right, so this is from National Geographic. It says Atlas of the Ancient World. Okay, and in this book, it says here on page number 79 or page number 80 and 81, the legacy of Alexander. Alexander the Great's routes of conquest and the territory he eventually controlled are overlaid here against the borders of today's countries. Alexander's journeys were remarkable not only for the thousands of miles traveled, but also for the speed with which they were made. In just 7 years, he marched his troops from Macedonia to the Hindu Kush, battling his way through enemy cities and founding cities along the way. Right? So it says from Macedonia, where I'm going to put my finger here, to the Hindu Kush. It says in just 7 years, he was able to conquer all of this land. Okay? From Macedonia in Europe all the way to Hindu Kush in India. All right? So he had a vast empire, right? In a short period of time. And the Bible also prophesies that, okay, in Daniel's 8. And it speaks about it in the book of Maccabees. I believe in Daniel, it makes mention that his feet touch not the ground, showing the swiftness in which he was able to conquer lands and conquer countries and conquer kings. Okay? So going back to First Maccabees, it says in verse 5, and after these things he fell sick and perceived that he should die. So meaning after he conquered all of these lands, he fell sick, okay, and he knew that eventually he would die. Now going back to this record real quick, before I go to another one, here we see an image of Alexander. We see a depiction of Alexander. Okay, this is on page number 78 on National Geographic Atlas of the Ancient World. Okay. Now I'm going to another point concerning Alexander because it says that he fell sick and he perceived that he should die. All right. It's another book called Archaeology, Discovering the World's Secrets. And this is by Gaynor Aaltonen. Gaynor, Gaynor. Aaltonen, Aaltonen. So it says here on page number 146, and before I do that, here's another image of Alexander on a gold coin. So it says here on page number 146, in relation to Alexander's death, because again, Maccabees says that he fell sick and he perceived that he should die. I'm going to answer that question later. Okay. Now, someone asked, he was a sodomite, wasn't he? Well, is that because this quote is going to make reference to that. It says here, is this Alexander's tomb? Speaking of this site. Okay, this excavation site. They're asking if this is Alexander's tomb, right? Or was it built for Hephaestion, Alexander's childhood friend and lover? So yes, he was known to dabble into, I guess they would call it today, LGBTQ activity. Going on, it says, like Alexander, Hephaestion died suddenly, succumbing to an unidentified ailment in 324 BC at Ecbatane in Iran. So both him and his lover passed away from an unidentifiable disease. I wonder what that was. Nonetheless, getting back to the scriptures, it tells us the following. I'm just showing that, not to highlight what he was dealing with, but more so just to highlight the fact that the book of Maccabees speaks about this history. Okay, from the Alexander's, his exploits as a ruler, as a conqueror, but also his death. And it can be verified in secular history. But going on, it says in verse number 8, and his servants bear rule, every one in his place. So those servants, you're going to find out when you go back to the book of Daniel 7, these are the four heads on the leopard. And they represent the four generals of Alexander. Now, there's one general in particular, or one family in particular, that we're going to focus on for today's lesson. Okay? I'm going to mention them in a few moments. It says here in verse number 9, and after his death, they all put crowns upon themselves, speaking about his four generals. So when it says they put crowns upon themselves, basically, all the places that Alexander conquered, they began to become the rulers of those lands. Okay? Each one took up rulership over the territories that Alexander conquered. Now, again, we're going to be focusing on one in particular. And the one that we're going to focus on is the one who had control over Mesopotamia. Okay? All right, this area here. Syria. Okay? Which is here, Damascus, Syria. And also, he took control of this area here, right by the Mediterranean. Okay? That's the land of Israel. All right? So we're going to focus on that general. So it goes on to say that after his death, they all put crowns upon themselves. So did their sons after them many years, and evils were multiplied in the earth. We're going to get into what those evils were, because those evils were a reflection of the religion that they imposed on earth. What was that religion? Well, in secular history, it's known as Hellenism. All right. Now, some people may ask, well, what is Hellenism? We're going to get into the workings of it, what they followed, what they imposed on us in particular. But really, Hellenism was this idea concocted by the Greeks as a way of taking control of the earth and not only enforcing rulership over the earth politically, but also religiously, as a means to try to keep the empire together. Now, when it comes to, let's go back to Babylon, okay, the Babylonian captivity, the Medo-Persian captivity. Those nations, their gods that they worshipped that were adverse to the God of Israel. But the Babylonians and the Persians, mainly the Persians, they weren't as, I guess you would say, they weren't as concerned with trying to enforce us to worship what they believed. If we decided while in Babylon to worship their God, so on and so forth, they welcomed it. But it wasn't necessarily enforced like it was under Hellenism, and especially under the Persians, where they actually allowed us to go back and build our temple for our God in Jerusalem. All right. So that really forcing religious beliefs from a political standpoint, as an empire standpoint, upon the nation of Israel, that really began with the Greek Empire, and specifically under it heightened, I will say, under Antiochus. All right. When you get the opportunity, you can read the book of Josephus, where he gives an account of how when Alexander came to the land of Israel, that he actually honored our forefathers. He honored the Jews. He honored the priest. All right. So there was some respect there with Alexander, as much debauchery he was dealing with, so on and so forth. The account that Josephus gives is that there was a good relationship, right? But when it came to Antiochus or Antiochus, that's when it really heightened upon us. And that's not to say that we didn't follow, our forefathers weren't following Hellenistic practices before Antiochus. Okay. In fact, as we read, we're going to show you that they followed those practices and that, at some point they may have stopped. But when Antiochus came, to enforce it, and it was actually one of our priests who decided that he was going to use this as leverage for him to gain rulership or to gain a position over the priesthood. It was a Benjamite who, first and foremost, wasn't supposed to be operating over the priesthood in the first place, but for political reasons, he wanted to try to leverage the power of the Greek Empire as a means of exalting himself and catapulting himself into that position of priesthood. All right. Again, I'm just checking. I want to make sure you all are still with me. All right. Okay. Just making sure you're still with me. I'm going to check from time to time to make sure that I'm not. Okay. Okay, good. All right. So for those who are coming in, we're just going through a little bit of history, dealing with the Feast of Dedication, and also trying to make this a question and answer without me waiting for you to ask the questions. I'm going to try to answer some of the questions you may have concerning this holy day. Okay, this holiday. So going back to First Maccabees, the first chapter and the 10th verse. So it says, and there came out of them a wicked root, Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus, or King Antiochus, or Antiochus the king. So his father was also named Antiochus, who had been in hostage at Rome. And he reigned in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks, meaning 137 years after Alexander's conquering, Antiochus Epiphanes sprung up. Okay. And it says, there came out of them, meaning out of the Greeks, but more specifically, out of one of the families of the four generals. That family being the family of the Seleucids. And the Seleucids, as I mentioned earlier, they had rulership over Mesopotamia, rulership over Syria, and also their rulership reached over into the land of Israel. Right? So it goes on to say in verse number 11, in those days there went out wicked men, or went out of Israel wicked men who persuaded many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are round about us, for since we have departed from them, we have had much sorrow. So here you had wicked Israelites, at the head of them a wicked Benjamite by the name of Onias, I believe his name was, who went and decided that they were going to make a covenant with the heathen, who at this time were the Greeks, in order to begin to make covenants with them. And when you go into the book of Maccabees, it makes mention of some of the covenants that they made, such as remaining uncircumcised, exercising, and being involved in the sports of the Greek gymnasium, which at this time, when you go into history, those things were performed in the nude. So people would be operating naked in these performances, wrestling and doing all these things, these things that you couldn't imagine, or performing these particular sports in the nude. Okay, like barbarians, like, I guess you would say, like heathen. Okay, so it goes on to say that in verse number 7, it says, or verse number 12, it says, so this device pleased them well. Then certain of the people were so forward therein that they went to the king, who gave them license to do after the ordinances of the heathen. Now adopting practices, which you're going to find out that these are the same practices that were being imposed through Hellenism. So we welcomed it. Okay. We welcomed our at this time, one of the guys who had aspirations to be a leader, to be a priest, welcomed it. And he got other people involved in this in this desire to take on Greek customs, right? And it reeks of some of the things that we saw during the civil rights movement. Even though we understand that a lot of our people, they were, you know, their heart was in the right place with many of our people involved in that time period. But you have to realize that the civil rights movement was co-opted. There were initial ideas as to what our people were desiring. Okay. And our desire wasn't necessarily to, initially, it wasn't necessarily to join in with the other nations on a, I guess you would say, on an everyday, I guess, social level. That wasn't the plan. It was more so to have civil rights, to be considered as an equal human being, and to also have the same opportunities to create for ourselves the same way the other nations were able to create for themselves. That was the initial idea, but it was co-opted because you had people who had their own agendas, their own lust, and they used the civil rights movement as a vehicle to propel their lust, which then made it now this thing of joining hand in hand and being able to operate in the same establishments with other nations and be in the same restaurants, not because that would end our problems, but because that now gave people access, those who had lust and things of that nature, it now gave them access to what they wanted, okay, from the other nations, okay, either monetarily, sexually, okay, and otherwise. But really, our desire was to be able to, you know, be considered equal and have equal opportunities, not just to work alongside, but to have the opportunity to actually create business for ourselves, where now we are, you know, the voice of the community, and we're able to now create businesses on that level, which we were able to do even before the civil rights movement. Okay. But moving on, it goes on to say in verse number 14, whereupon they built a place of exercise at Jerusalem according to the customs of the heathen. And of course, when we bring this out, some people may ask, well, is it okay to work out? Is it okay to go to the gym, so on and so forth? And the answer is yes. There's nothing wrong with going into the gym. But again, you have to realize that these things were coupled not with just working out and sports activities. It was coupled with the nudity, coupled with the worships and the honors of the Greek gods, so on and so forth. And even there, you see traces of that. What happens when people go to the gym? They have this urge to get as naked as possible without being actually, if that makes any sense. All right. But again, if you want to go out and work, pump some iron, so on and so forth, whatever you do at the gym, there's nothing wrong with that. So I want to make that clear. Verse number 15 says, and made themselves uncircumcised and forsook the holy covenant and joined themselves to the heathen and were sold to do mischief. Now, a precept we have here is the book of Jeremiah, the 10th chapter, in the first verse, where it says, hear ye the word of the Lord, hear ye which the word of the Lord speaketh unto you, O house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, which is the key point. We were commanded to learn not the way of the heathen. All right. And then it goes on down to verse 4, giving you the custom of the Christmas tree. And this is important because in the same month, around the same time that everyone is getting into the holiday spirit for the holidays of this world, we have a holiday, right, within our particular Bible, within our customs, within our history, which is actually about separating from the worships of the nations, separating from the practices of the Gentiles. Whereas this holiday, even though it's been commercialized and there's really no one really even cares about the quote unquote the spiritual veneer of the holiday called Christmas. They're more so into the commercial aspect of it. But at one point, it did have a commercial veneer or a spiritual veneer, a Christian veneer, if you will, where people would say, well, it's about Christ. He's the reason for the season, even though Christmas really has nothing to do with Christ. People would at least try to, market it as a Christian holiday, okay, or present it as a Christian holiday. All right. But getting back to the point I was making is the fact that this holiday is about joining. When I say this holiday, I'm speaking about the December 25th, the upcoming holiday that the world is following. It's about joining in as one and joining in with the world and celebrating a pagan festival. Whereas this holiday, the Feast of Dedication, is about separating from that or separating from the pagan practices that were imposed upon us during the Greek Empire. Okay. Now, some people may be asking, well, what about my family who's going to be celebrating Christmas, so on and so forth? How can I, as we were mentioning in a radio show, how can I get them from that table, okay, which the Bible says the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. You cannot eat at the Lord's table and also at the table of devils. So the question is, how do I get them from the devil's table to the Lord's table? And if we have time, we'll go into that also. Okay. But getting back to the point, jumping back to the book of Maccabees, chapter 1 Maccabees 1 and 20. All right. Just making sure everything is still okay. Good. Right. So going on to verse number 20, it says, and after that Antiochus had smitten Egypt, he returned again in the 143rd year and went up against Israel in Jerusalem with a great multitude. So this is an example of even though you may have a situation where you have two Idumean or two Greek generals who operated under Alexander, okay, or two families who were descendants of Alexander, but yet one of those families, that being Antiochus, actually went to war against another one of those Greek families, being the Ptolemies, and wanted to take over the dominion or the land of the Ptolemies, which was Egypt. Okay, so it shows that there is infighting even amongst Edom and their rulership, so on and so forth, amongst these empires. Okay, so it goes on to say that in verse number 21, or in verse number 20, it says that he returned in the 143rd year and went up against Israel in Jerusalem with a great multitude, and entered proudly into the sanctuary and took away the golden altar and the candlestick of light and of all the vessels thereof. Now, the candlestick of light is what we call, or what is called today, mainly in Orthodox Judaism or mainstream Judaism, whatever term you want to use, the menorah. Okay, the candlestick of light. Some people may ask, is it okay to have a menorah? The answer to that is that's one's prerogative. If you want to have a menorah, that's fine. Just make sure you don't have a menorah with the six-pointed star on the stand. Sometimes you'll have the menorahs and they'll have a six-pointed star engraved either on the stand or somewhere on the menorah. So that's fine. But we also understand that Christ and those seven angels over the seven churches are that they are now our candlestick of light. They are our representation of a menorah, if you will. The third question, or the second question many people may have is the menorah necessary for the celebration of the Feast of Dedication? And this question may come from the idea that you may see, again, mainstream Judaism, you may see them with the seven candlesticks, okay, and every day for the day of dedication, or what they call the Feast of Lights, they're lighting a candle. And ask, well, is that in the story of Maccabees? Well, in case I'm not able to answer this or come back to this later, the answer is no. They do not get that from the story of Maccabees. It's a custom that I don't know where they got it from. I'm pretty sure if we just pulled up a web page right now, it'll probably explain where they got it from, but we don't have time for that. We just know that it's not necessarily in the Bible. The Feast of Lights, not necessarily in the Bible. Not, it's more so their tradition in dealing with the story of Maccabees than the actual story itself. Nowhere in the story is there a lighting each day of 8 candlesticks. Okay. And the the other stories and legends they have behind that. So that's not necessarily in the story of Maccabees. All right. While it's mentioning the candlestick of light, someone may also mention, well, I'll deal with that later. I'll deal with Hanukkah a bit later. All right. But jumping down, okay, this just goes through the distress that our people were under this empire. Jumping down, it goes to verse number 41. It says, moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people. So now this is getting into the religious aspect of the empire. Okay, the Hellenism. Right? Now the word Hellenism goes back to the word Hellas, which is an ancient name or one of the ancient names for the land of Greece. Okay? So one of the names for Greece was Hellas, and the inhabitants were called Hellenes. Our people or anyone outside of the Greeks who were not, naturally of that stock, who adopted their religion and adopted the ideology that we're about to read, were referred to as Hellenists. Just the same way today, someone, if they adopt it, regardless of their nationality, if they decided to become what the world calls a follower of Christ, they would be collectively referred to as Christians, regardless of nationality. If you were, regardless of nationality, to follow the teachings of Muhammad and so on and so forth, you would be called a Muslim. Okay, so that's what Hellenists are, or Hellenists were. They were pretty much any nation outside of the Greeks who adopted the Greek way of life. Now, the Bible gives us the history of Hellenist and Hellenism from the eyes of the Israelites and how it affected the Israelites. Okay, those of us who adopted the ways of the Greeks, language and customs, so on and so forth, we were also referred to as Hellenists. Okay, so going on, it mentions here in verse number 43. Yea, also, it says, 42, it says, 1 Maccabees 1:42, and it should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. So this wasn't necessarily too much of a problem for the other nations, even though they had their different worships, their different pantheons and gods they worship. It wasn't too much of a problem for them because they were used to worshiping other gods or various gods. Verse number 43 says, yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion and sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath, for the king has sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah that they should follow the strange laws of the land and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbaths and festival days and pollute the sanctuary and holy people. Excuse me, it says, verse 47, set up altars and groves and chapels of idols. Okay, meaning sanctuaries of idols. And sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beast. Verse 48 says that they shall also leave their children uncircumcised and make their souls abominable with all manner of uncleanness and profanation, to the end that they might forget the law and change all the ordinances, and whosoever would not according to the commandment of the king, he said he should die. So if you did not follow these customs that were being imposed through Antiochus, okay, these customs of Hellenism, he stated that you should die. And thereby it became illegal to keep our customs and our practices, our Sabbath, our holy days, to circumcise your children, okay, became an offense, which was, according to them, punishable by death. Okay. Not to worship idols, to do, you have the example of those, I believe it's in this chapter, where they tried to follow the Sabbath in secret. And when they were found out, they were punished by being set on fire. Okay. Women who circumcised their children. When it was found that the children were circumcised, those children were killed along with their mothers. Okay. So it goes on to say in verse number 50, and whosoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said he should die. In the selfsame manner wrote he to his whole kingdom and appointed overseers over all the people, commanding the cities of Judah to sacrifice city by city. Then many of the people were gathered unto them, to wit, everyone that forsook the law, and so they committed evils in the land and drove the Israelites into secret places, even wheresoever they could flee for secure, meaning for safety. So one of the prophecies or curses from Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 25 says, the Lord calls thee, or shall cause thee, to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and shall flee 7 ways before them. And thou shalt be removed into all kingdoms of the earth. So in other words, we would have no power to defend ourselves against our enemies. That was the case for the Israelites under the rulership of Antiochus until the revolt, until the uprising. Jumping down to verse number 54, it says, now the 15th day of the month Casliu, in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar, and builded idol altars throughout all the cities, or throughout the cities of Judah on every side. So the abomination of desolation was prophesied in the book of Daniel. But we also understand that this is another example of a reoccurring prophecy. We understand that there was the abomination of desolation that was prophesied by Daniel and was partially fulfilled during the time of the Maccabees. But we also understand that this was prophesied again by Christ. Okay, to show you that even after the time of the Maccabees, Christ prophesied of another abomination of desolation. All right, so moving on. Let me see here. First Maccabees 1:46 ends it by saying, and there was great wrath upon Israel. Now we're going to jump over to the book of First Maccabees, the 2nd chapter. Now we're getting into the revolt. Afterwards, we're going to get into the establishment, or the establishing of the Feast of Tabernacle. And then after that, we'll get into the last portion dealing with the spiritual significance, as well as many other questions that you may have concerning this holy day, how to keep it, just so on and so forth, all those different aspects. First Maccabees 2:1 says, in those days rose Mattathias, the son of John, the son of Simeon, a priest of the sons of Joarib, from Jerusalem, and dwelt in Modin. And he had 5 sons, Johanan called Caddis. That is speaking of Mattathias, okay? Mattathias had 5 sons, Johanan, or John, Caddis, Simon, Thasi, Judas, who was called Maccabeus. So some people may wonder, well, where do we get the name Maccabee from? Well, Maccabee was a nickname for Judah, or Judas. Okay, he was referred to as Judas Maccabees, or Judas Maccabeus. all right, which in many places is translated as hammer, okay? And this is to describe the force by which he came down on the Greek Empire in this revolt against their rulership. So the question is, if this was a nickname for Judah specifically, how did the family become known as the Maccabees? And how did the book come to be known as Maccabees? Well, to go into that real quick, we have the New Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha. Okay, the New Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha. And this is from Oxford. And we're going to go to page number 1555. This is the opening or the introduction to the book of Maccabees. And when you go here, it says name, right? Meaning, where did this book get its name from? Why is it called Maccabees? It says the name of First Maccabees derives from the church fathers Hippolytus, 170 to 236 CE, Origen, 185, 254 BC, or CE, AD, as we would call it, and Jerome, 342 to 420 AD, who notes that he found the first book of the Maccabees in Hebrew. So they're stating that, I believe it's Jerome that found a Hebrew copy of the book of Maccabees. So yes, this work at one point did exist in Hebrew, right? The name Maccabee, here's our key point, a nickname meaning hammer given to Judas, one of the sons, was extended in Christian, but not Jewish tradition to include his family. Origen said that the book was titled Sarbeth Sabaniel, okay? Sarbeth Sabaniel, a Greek transliteration possibly suggesting in original Hebrew, the book of the house of the princes of Israel. So they're saying that possibly the original name of the title of the book of Maccabees was the book of the house of the princes of Israel. All right. And its original Hebrew title, but they're saying that that's their suggestion. Now, the key point I wanted to pull out is the fact that the later people would use it to refer to the record. And because it was referred to, the record was referred to as Maccabees. That family became known as the Maccabees, but really the family name is the Hasmoneans. Okay. So going back to the scriptures, jumping down to verse number 6, First Maccabees 2 and 6, it says, and when he saw the blasphemies that were committed in Judah and Jerusalem, he said, woe is me. Wherefore was I born to see the misery of my people and of the holy city, and to dwell there, when it was delivered into the hand of the enemy, and the sanctuary into the hand of strangers. Her temple, meaning the temple of Jerusalem, is become as a man without glory. Her glorious vessels are carried away into captivity. Her infants are slain in the streets, her young men with the sword of the enemy. What nation have not had part in her and gotten her spoils? Which is something we mention all the time. All nations have benefited from the captivity of the nation of Israel. Verse 11 says, all her ornaments are taken away. Of a free woman she has become a bondslave. And behold, our sanctuary, even our beauty and our glory, is laid waste, and the Gentiles have profaned it. To what end, therefore, shall we live any longer? Then Mattathias and his sons rent their clothes and put on sackcloth and mourned very sore. Now, we're not going to read the whole story of the revolt. For those who would like to actually read a summary of the revolt, and of course, fact-checking the information in the book with the Book of Maccabees, with Josephus and other records, historical records, which make mention of the revolt. You can go to the book Judea Trembles Under Rome by Rudolph R. Windsor. We're in this book from page number 17, chapter 1, all the way through, let's see here, all the way to about page number 22. He gives a summary of this revolt. Okay, so you can read this if you want to just do a summary, but also remember you want to always fact check it with Maccabees, Josephus, and other historical records which make mention of the Maccabean revolt. But now getting to the actual establishment of the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Dedication. First Maccabees chapter 4 verse 1 says, it's called Judea Trembles Under Rome by Rudolph R. Windsor. All right, First Maccabees 4:1 says, Then took Georgius 5,000 men and 1,000 of the best horsemen and removed out of the camp by night, to the end that he might rush in upon the camp of the Jews and smite them suddenly, and the men of the fortress were his guides. Now when Judas heard thereof, he himself removed, and the valiant men with him, that he might smite the king's army, which was at Emmaus. While as yet the forces were dispersed from the camp, in the mean season came Georgius by night into the camp of Judas, and when he found no man there, he sought them in the mountains, for he said, These fellows flee from us. But as soon as it was day, Judas showed himself in the plain with 3,000 men, who nevertheless had neither armor nor swords to their minds. And they saw the camp of the heathen, that it was strong and well harnessed, and compassed round about with horsemen, and these were expert of war, speaking about the army of the Gentiles, the army of the Greeks. Then said Judah to the men that were with him, Fear ye not their multitude, neither be ye afraid of their assault. Remember how our fathers were delivered in the Red Sea, when Pharaoh pursued them with an army. Now therefore let us cry unto heaven, if peradventure the Lord will have mercy upon us, and remember the covenant of our fathers, and destroy this host before our face this day. That so all the heathen may know that there is one who delivereth and saveth Israel. And we know his name is Ahiah Ashar Ahiah. Verse number 12 says, Then the strangers lifted up their eyes and saw them coming over against them. Wherefore they went out of the camp to battle. But they that were with Judas sounded their trumpets. So they joined battle, and the heathen, being discomfited, fled into the plain. Howbeit all the hindmost of them were slain with the sword, for they pursued them unto Gazera, and unto the plains of Idumea, and Azotus, and Jamnia, so that they were slain of them upon a 3,000 men. This done, Judas returned again with his host from pursuing them. Verse 17 says, And said to the people, Be not greedy of the spoil, inasmuch as there is battle before us. So in other words, the battle is not finished. Let's not focus on the spoil. Let's finish on completing this battle. Verse 18 says, And Georgius and his host are here by us in the mountain, but stand ye now against our enemies and overcome them. And after this ye may boldly take the spoils. As Judah was yet speaking these words, there appeared a part of them looking out of the mountain. And when they perceived that the Jews had put their host to flight, they were burning their tents, or burning the tents, for the smoke was seen, for the smoke that was seen declared what was done. When therefore they perceived these things, they were sore afraid, and seeing also the host of Judah in the plain ready to fight, they fled everyone into the land of strangers. Then Judah returned to the spoil, or to spoil the tents, and they got much gold and silver and blue silk and the purple of the sea and great riches. After this, they went home and sung a song of thanksgiving, not the Thanksgiving that just passed. What was it? Yesterday or the day before, whatever day Thanksgiving was, right? Not Thanksgiving Thursday, but by Thanksgiving just simply mean a song of giving thanks to the Most High for deliverance, right? And only reason I'm mentioning this is because some people may see Thanksgiving offering in the Bible, and they may try to associate it with the holiday when there is no association outside of the actual name itself or the word itself. All right. It says, and they went home after this and sung a song of thanksgiving and praised the Lord in heaven because it is good, because his mercy endureth forever. Thus Israel had a great deliverance that day. Now all the strangers that had escaped came and told Lysias what had happened, who then, when he had heard thereof, was confounded and discouraged, because neither such things as he would were done unto Israel, nor such things as the king commanded him were come to pass. Then the next year thereof, or therefore, following Lysias, gathered together 3,000 choice men of foot and 5,000 horsemen, that he might subdue them. So they came into Idumea and pitched their tents in Bethsura, and Judas met them with 10,000 men. All right. It goes on to say, verse number 30, and when he saw the mighty army, he prayed and said, Blessed art thou, O Savior of Israel, who didst quell the violence of the mighty men by the hand of thy servant David, and gavest the host of strangers into the hands of Jonathan, the son of Saul, and his armor bearer. Shut up this army in the hand of thy people Israel, and let them be confounded in their power and horsemen. Make them to be of no courage, and cause the boldness of their strength to fall away, and let them quake at their destruction. Cast them down with the sword of them and that love thee, and let all those that know thy name praise thee with thanksgiving. So they joined the battle, and there were slain of the host of Lysias about 5,000 men. Even before them they were slain. Now when Lysias saw his army put to flight, and the manliness of Judas's soldiers, and how they were ready to either live or die valiantly, he went to Antiochia, and gathered together a company of strangers, and having made his army greater than it was, he purposed to come again to Judea. So first and foremost, we can see that this is a war comprised of many different battles. It wasn't like there was just one battle in which we put them to flight and that was it. We would put them to flight in one battle, and they would come back with more men. Put them to flight again. They would come back a year later, okay, with more men ready for war. We would put them to ready for battle. We would put them to flight in one battle, and they would recoup and try to come back for another battle. So this was a war comprised of many different battles with men who weren't necessarily trained in the, I guess you would say, it wasn't like they had camps in which they were practicing for war and, practicing martial arts and all these different things that people normally look at when it comes to warfare and battle. Now, the Greeks, they were well trained. They were experts at war. In fact, they became conquerors of the earth through their expert warfare. But with us, it was mainly the spirit of the Most High. Now, of course, these were valiant men of courage, okay, who were willing to stand and be used by the Most High to win these wars. But they weren't necessarily as trained in the traditional sense, if you understand what I'm saying. Okay, so it goes on to say in verse number 36, then said Judas and his brethren, behold, our enemies are discomfited. Let us go up to cleanse and dedicate the sanctuary. Now that word dedicate, believe it or not, is where we get the term Hanukkah from, or Hanukkah from. It's simply a word meaning dedicate. For an example, when you get the opportunity, look up the name of Enoch. The name Enoch in Hebrew is Chanakh, which means dedicate, okay, or dedicated. Hanukkah is the feminine form of Chanakh or Enoch. Both mean dedicated, one masculine, one feminine. Okay. So that's where the term Hanukkah comes from. So when you hear that, understand that the word itself is not evil. It's not, some sinister plot of the Jews to try to create their own holiday. Hanukkah is actually a Hebrew word which is related to the Feast of Dedication. Okay? But we will say that there are practices within current day, the current celebration of Hanukkah that necessarily don't go back to the Bible. Okay? When you see people playing with a dreidel and you see people lighting candles and all those different things, those don't necessarily go back to the actual biblical story of the Maccabees and the rededication of the temple. These are more so practices that Jewish people picked up through time. All right? They picked these up through time and made them customs within, their celebration. All right? Verse number 37 says, upon this, all the hosts assembled themselves together and went up into the Mount Zion. And when they saw the sanctuary desolate, and the altar profaned, and the gates burnt up, and the shrubs growing, and the courts as in a forest, or in one of the mountains, yea, and the priest's chambers pulled down, they rent their clothes and made great lamentation and cast ashes upon their heads, and fell down flat to the ground upon their faces, and blew an alarm with the trumpets, and cried toward heaven. Then Judas appointed certain men to fight against those that were in the fortress until he had cleansed the sanctuary. And he chose priests of blameless conversation and such as had pleasure in the law, and bear out the defiled stones into a unclean place. And when they were consulted, as they consulted what to do with the altar of burnt offerings, which was profaned, they thought it best to pull it down, lest it should be a reproach to them, because the heathen had defiled it, wherefore they pulled it down, and laid up the stones in the mountain of the temple in a convenient place, until there should come a prophet to show them what should be done with them. Then they took the whole stones according to the law, and built a new altar according to the former. And they made up the sanctuary and the things that were within the temple, and hollowed the courts, and they made new holy vessels. And in the temple they brought the candlestick and the altar of burnt offerings and of incense and the table. Now, jumping down to verse number 52, 1 Maccabees 4 and 52, it says, and on the 5th and 20th day of the 9th month, which is called Casliu, in the 148th year, they rose up betimes in the morning, meaning often, or early in the morning, okay? Verse number 53 says, and offered sacrifice according to the law upon the new altar of burnt offerings, which they had made. Look at what time and what the heathen had profaned, and what day the heathen had profaned it. Even in that was it dedicated with songs and cisterns and harps and cymbals. So meaning in the same day, years prior, or I believe maybe a year prior, Antiochus profaned the temple. Now here it is a year later, in that same day, it's being rededicated. The temple is being cleansed. We're giving up prayers to the Most High for conquering the enemies and being able to rededicate his temple and offer new sacrifices and build a new altar and all those things that we did in rededicating and preparing the temple for worship. Verse 55 says, then all the people fell on their faces, worshiping and praising the God of heaven, who had given them good success. And so they kept the dedication of the altar 8 days, and offered burnt offerings with gladness, and sacrificed the sacrifice of deliverance and praise. Just one moment. Got to do my check. Make sure you're all still with me. Okay. All right. So we'll answer those questions. I see people have questions as far as how to celebrate, so on and so forth. We will answer those afterwards. Just one moment. One moment. All right. So we're going to go about maybe 20 more minutes and we'll be finished. All right. So getting back to the book of First Maccabees, it says in verse number 58, thus were they very thus was there very great gladness among the people, for that the reproach of the heathen was put away. Moreover, Judas and his brethren with the whole congregation of Israel ordained that the days of the dedication of the altar shall be kept in their season from year to year by the space of 8 days, from the 25th day of the month Casliu, with mirth and gladness. At that time also they builded up the Mount Zion with high walls and strong towers round about, lest the Gentiles should come and tread it down as they had done before. And they set there a garrison to keep it, and fortified Bethsura to preserve it, that they might have a defense against Idumea. Number one, when the Greeks would come in, they were coming in through Idumea, but also we know that the Idumeans pushed north. Idumea or Edom is south of the land of Judea, and what the Idumeans did during the Babylonian captivity is they pushed north. Okay, so they pushed to the point where some of the land that originally belonged to Israel, they started to enter into that land, the southern parts of Judea. All right, so during this time period, we pushed them back into where they were, and also we built the fortress so that they would not be able to use that as an entry port or entry point back into our land. Okay, so that's the historical aspect of the Feast of Dedication. Now, some people may ask, well, why isn't this holy day in Leviticus 23? Well, for obvious reasons, which I'm pretty sure many of you could guess. The reason why this is not in Leviticus 23 is because this holy day has a significance which came after the time that Moses would receive those laws of the holy days in Leviticus 23, when the Most High says, even these are my feast, the Sabbath, the Passover, unleavened bread, the feast of weeks, okay, the tabernacles, and all the holy days that are mentioned in Leviticus 23. Those particular holidays or holy days were initially the ones that were established and prescribed for us to keep under Moses. Later, you would have other holy days which would be ordained as ordinances based on events that took place within the nation of Israel, okay? Mainly dealing with our deliverance, like the Feast of Purim in the book of Esther, which, since I mentioned Purim, let me mention something else as far as gift giving. I believe during this time period for Hanukkah in mainstream Judaism, it's kept as a day of giving gifts. Well, according to the Bible, the day of giving gifts is Purim, which is not in this month, but in the 12th month. Okay? So that's when we deal with the giving of gifts, so on and so forth. Getting back to the point, Purim serves as an example as a holy day that wasn't in the book of Leviticus 23, but later became instituted or ordained based on a deliverance, in specific, the deliverance of the Israelites during the Persian captivity from Haman, the Idumean, okay, the Agagite or the Amalekite. Okay, and this was done under of course, the divine spirit and divine guidance of the Most High through Mordecai and Esther. All right, so dedication is a similar holiday in that regard, that it was ordained later based on a deliverance that happened later in our history. All right, and you have other days of remembrance. Other days also mentioned in Maccabees, right? Which are more so just days of remembrance. Okay. So moving forward, dealing with the spiritual significance. And before we get there, let's show that this was celebrated. Even though it's first mentioned in Maccabees, it is celebrated in the Bible, in the New Testament. So we're going to go to the book of St. John, the 10th chapter. And let's go down. St. John chapter 10. Let's see here. St. John chapter 10, verse 22, it says, "And it was at Jerusalem at the feast of dedication." I'm going to read that again. "And it was at Jerusalem, the feast of dedication, and it was winter." Okay. "And Yeshua walked in the temple in Solomon's porch." So Christ was present at the feast of dedication, at the same temple that was rededicated on the first celebration of the dedication, going back to the book of First Maccabees chapter 4. Okay. So what is the spiritual significance, if any? Well, we mentioned earlier, I'm going to read one scripture, and I'm going to just go on for about maybe 15 minutes answering various questions before we close out. But let's go to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and 16. 1 Corinthians 3:16 says, "Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are." So now that we understand that we are God's temple, we must now do what? Let's go to Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Romans 12 and 1 says, "I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the sure mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice." What was offered in the temple? Sacrifices. Okay. So now we represent the temple of God. And of course, we know that Christ is our example of sacrifice, and therefore we must also present ourselves as a living sacrifice, as is mentioned in the book of Romans 6. "Know ye not, as many of you as were baptized into his baptism, were baptized into his death?" So, as Christ gave up himself on the cross and died once, our baptism is a symbol, or it's us laying down the old man, killing the old man, sacrificing the old man, laying him on the altar, and becoming a new creature in Christ. So it says, "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service." The same way the priests had a service in the Old Testament's temple. You had priests set over every course of the temple. We also have a service. What is our service? What is our reasonable service? Offering our bodies as a living sacrifice. And during this time period, for those who may ask the question, how do we celebrate this holiday throughout the 8 days? Well, the first day we tend to celebrate as a Sabbath, okay, as well as the 8th day. In between that, for those who may ask, are all 8 days a Sabbath, or do we keep all 8 days as Sabbaths? The answer is no. Okay. What do we do during these 8 days? Well, if it is a feast of dedication and we are the temples of God, as the temple was dedicated during the time of the Maccabees, that we must also reflect on our lives, reflect on our walk, in our attempt to dedicate ourselves to the Most High. Not that we don't dedicate to ourselves to the Most High all year round, or that we're not supposed to dedicate ourselves to the Most High all year round, but this holy day is actually specifically giving us that time period to reflect. Similar to the Day of Atonement, where we're giving that time to fast and reflect. Okay? So now, opposed to just the festivities and just the celebration, which is good, okay, all of those things are congruent with the celebration of the feast of dedication. But the key part is the reflection, rededicating yourself to the Most High. Okay, rededicating your walk. If you need to during this time period, pull out your journal, pull out your notepad, write down things you want to, work out within yourself, and reflect on how you can either work on those things, if these are things that you have worked on in the past, if these are things you want to get better at, okay, write those things down. Write down goals and things you want to do in order to, not just reflect, but actually put into action how you want to serve the Most High in a new and a living way from year to year, so on and so forth. All those things, just write them down and pray that the Most High be with you and strengthens you throughout the year to fulfill your goals for this time of dedication. That's just one thing you can do. Of course, there's a million things you can probably do and think of on your own, activities and things you can do to make this a delight. As Isaiah says, making the Sabbath a delight. Pretty sure there's many ideas you can come up with, but that's just one of many. Okay. Is it a double Sabbath? Well, today is a Sabbath, and at sundown, we enter into another Sabbath. Okay. So in that regard, yes, it is a double Sabbath. Okay. Someone asked, can they pay bills this week? I would hope so, unless you can write a letter to the energy company and tell them, or the light bill company, and tell them that you're celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles, and because of that, this is an IOU. Unless you can do that, I would hope that you pay your bills this week. Okay. Again, the whole week itself is not necessarily a Sabbath. Okay. Someone says, like a New Year's resolution, similar, but we know that the New Year's revolution is not necessarily a new year, but the same concept. And this time, actually doing it for real, not making a New Year's resolution, and then a week later, you're back to what you claimed you were going to put down for the new year, right? But yes, it's not necessarily people being too legalistic. I understand sometimes the question, you want to try to do things right as we enter into this walk. People we've been, the story is we've been lied to so many times. We want to make sure that we're doing things the right way, which is understandable. So we appreciate the question, and it's a good question because many others may have similar questions, but they may be thinking, "Oh, this is I'm gonna be looked upon as stupid if I ask this question," even though it's not a stupid question. It's actually a good question. But the answer is yes. If you have bills and things of that nature throughout this week, pay your bills. If you got to work throughout the week, go to work. The whole week itself is not a Sabbath. Okay. Are we allowed to fast? That's between you and the Most High. But this particular holy day, as we read in Maccabees, was a day more so given over festivities and feasting and remembering how we rededicated the temple to the Most High. Okay. How many temples were rededicated throughout the year of fighting? Well, we have the original temple that was built by Solomon. After during the Babylonian captivity, portions of the temple were destroyed. So there had to be a rebuilding of the temple after we returned from the Medo-Persian captivity. Okay, there's certain aspects of the wall and certain things that were destroyed that we had to build up. Okay, so that was one rebuilding. And then even after the temple, which is called the Temple of Zerubbabel, after that was uh, desecrated by the Greeks and the wicked Israelites who followed the Greeks, then it had to be rededicated, and certain aspects of it had to be reconstructed again. Okay, like the altar and other aspects of it had to be rebuilt. Then during the time of Herod, he I guess you would say he remodeled the temple and magnified it and made it this beautiful. History makes mention of it as being a beautiful work of art. Okay, so you have Herod's temple, which Christ makes mention of in Matthew 24, when the disciples and everyone they're marveling over the magnificence of the temple, and Christ says, "See ye not all these things? One stone should not be left upon another," meaning that temple was also destroyed. Yes, this holy day ends next week. Can you please clarify the elders talk about Thanksgiving and us partaking in that feast with a purpose? Yes. First and foremost, we weren't necessarily saying that, just go out and celebrate Thanksgiving just for the sake of getting yourself a plate of food. Okay. What we're saying is that, listen, you have family members who are still in the dark, who don't have any knowledge of the truth. And these are the times of years, these are the times that they are afforded in a society to be able to actually come together as family and deal in feasting and festivities and so on and so forth. So if you're like Paul mentions, and as Paul actually did in ancient times, having to go into the idol's temple and having to go into different places for the sake of converting brothers and sisters. Okay. If you're in that particular situation where you've been called to minister to someone who you know is going to be present there, who you may not be able to actually have access to or deal with any other time of year, whatever the case may be, then in those situations you would use grace to be able to get to that person, not necessarily just celebrating just to get a plate of food or different things that people make excuses for. The ultimate goal is the winning of the souls of our brothers and sisters, regardless of where they are. Okay. Exactly. Someone says on the feast of dedication, just make the food you ate on Thanksgiving. Hey, absolutely. So if you want to throw down a feast, if you, of course, not celebrating Thanksgiving, foregoing that. Okay. Now, for those who did go to see family on Thanksgiving, that's your prerogative. Okay. That's between you and the Most High. That's your business. But for those who did not, you can decide to throw down and get yourself some yams and get yourself the fried chicken and the collard greens and the cornbread and people love your sweet potato pie. All right. All that stuff our people love. You can still do that to the Most High on the Feast of Dedication. Okay. The regular Sabbath ends tonight, sundown. But of course, the following day, okay, or sundown tonight marks the beginning of the Feast of Dedication. So that Sabbath ends tomorrow, sundown. Okay. Someone says they threw down on some Filipino food. Hey, you like it? I love it. Whatever floats your boat, make sure you get up on it for the Feast of Dedication. If you can't celebrate it amongst a body, can't celebrate it amongst a local area, do what you can amongst yourself, do what you can amongst your family. If you got to make yourself, if it's just yourself, if it's just you, make yourself a delightful meal, and make this day a delight. Okay. Yes. As long as the food is clean, that's it. Let's make that loud and clear. As long as the food is clean, which I'm pretty sure everyone understands that. And on another note, that's one thing I can't stand. And I'm not saying you, Shaquilla, but I'm saying you have people who've been in the truth 10, 20 years. You have a person coming to the truth 2 years and they see meat in the greens and they ask them, what kind of meat is that? As if someone who's been in the truth 10, 15, 20 years is going to put pork in the meat or put pork meat in the greens. Okay? If you're eating amongst someone in the truth, you shouldn't have to ask that question. If you have to ask that question, that's a problem. All right? But nonetheless, I know you got people who don't like chicken, who are chicken haters. Listen, I had some, listen, I may have some chicken very soon. It won't be tonight, but I'm going to have some chicken very soon. And one day we may just have to come on YouTube and reaffirm that and just have some fried chicken live on YouTube. Just so people understand that we have absolutely nothing against fried chicken or any other chicken for that matter. Okay? Now, if you don't like chicken, if you feel that chicken is unclean and things of that nature, then that's your prerogative. You don't have to eat chicken. I'm not gonna come over here live on YouTube and tell you that you are evil and you're the devil for not eating chicken. Okay, so we expect the same thing. Don't come on and tell us that we're wrong because we do eat chicken, because the scripture don't say anything of that effect. All right, it's your misunderstanding of a scripture. That's all. But again, if for whatever reason, even if the Bible says it's clean, or the Bible doesn't necessarily make mention of chicken by name, but you feel that you don't want to eat it because of its habits, whoever the case may be, hey, that's your business. That's your prerogative. Okay. But with that, I want to say bless you all and shalom. May you all have a blessed feast of dedication. I want to shout out to all the congregations throughout the four corners of the earth who are celebrating. Shout out to those in Philadelphia, New York, wherever you are, LA, the West Coast, in the South, okay, Atlanta, all the areas, okay, all the areas throughout the South and all you other brothers and sisters throughout the four corners of the earth. If you're in Europe, if you are in the islands, wherever you are, I want to wish you all a blessed Sabbath and a blessed feast of dedication. May you enjoy the rest of your Sabbath, and may the Most High be with you. Shalom. All right. Someone says from Memphis, Shalom. If you're in Memphis, if you're in Tennessee, you're celebrating the feast of dedication and you're watching this, give all honor and praise to the Most High. I want to give my shout out. I'm not going to, throw out any dates, but listen, I'm getting the travel dates ready for the small little GOCC South tour. I will be in Tennessee in the near future. So with that, I want to say bless you all and shalom. You all stay strong, stay prayed up until we all see Zion. Shalom.